Ever notice how a millennial and a Gen Z person can experience the exact same situation and somehow react like they're living on different planets? Imagine this. The Wi-Fi goes down for an hour. One person sighs, shrugs, maybe makes coffee and thinks, guess I'll wait. The other immediately checks mobile data, opens 5 different apps, searches for outage reports, and somehow ends up watching conspiracy theories about internet infrastructure. Or maybe you've seen it at work. A millennial quietly stays late because that's just what you're supposed to do. Meanwhile, the Gen Z coworker closes their laptop exactly at 5 o'clock, smiles politely, and says, "See you tomorrow." At first glance, it looks like laziness, or entitlement, or maybe confidence, but the truth is much more interesting. These aren't just personality differences. They're psychological adaptations to 2 completely different worlds. The generation before grew up believing the future was something you built one careful step at a time. The generation after wondered if the future would stay stable long enough to build anything at all. And once you understand that, their habits start making perfect sense. Maybe you're Gen Z. Maybe you're a millennial trying to understand your younger sibling, coworker, or even your own child. Either way, by the end of this video, you might realize these differences aren't random. They are the emotional fingerprints of 2 generations shaped by completely different realities. The first difference is something psychologists sometimes call certainty versus flexibility. Picture 2 people starting a new job. The millennial spends the first few weeks trying to fit in, learning the culture, watching how everyone behaves before speaking too much. They don't necessarily love every rule, but they assume that's simply how workplaces work. Now picture the Gen Z employee. Within 3 days, they're asking why a meeting exists if it could have been an email. They're suggesting different software. They're questioning company traditions that everyone else accepted years ago. To older generations, this can seem disrespectful, but psychologically, something else is happening. Millennials largely grew up during years when institutions still carried a certain promise: work hard, go to college, stay loyal, build experience. Success would eventually follow. Gen Z watched many of those promises crack. They saw student debt explode, housing become less affordable, entire careers disappear almost overnight. So instead of trusting systems automatically, they trust adaptability. If a system doesn't make sense, why protect it? If a rule isn't useful, why keep following it? It isn't necessarily rebellion, it's efficiency mixed with skepticism. And maybe you've caught yourself doing this too, looking at an old tradition and quietly asking, wait, why are we still doing this? Then there's another psychological divide: privacy. Ironically, Gen Z grew up sharing everything online, yet many of them protect their real emotions more carefully than millennials ever did. That sounds backwards. Shouldn't the social media generation overshare the most? Not exactly. Think about it. Every awkward face, every bad haircut, every embarrassing opinion could potentially live forever online. When your entire adolescence happens with an invisible audience watching, you become incredibly aware of how you're being perceived. Millennials experienced the internet growing alongside them. Gen Z never knew life without it. So while millennials often post memories, Gen Z curates identities, sometimes several of them. One account for friends, another for family, a private account, a public account, different versions of themselves depending on who's watching. Psychologists call this context switching, but emotionally it can feel exhausting, not because they're fake, because they're constantly aware of different audiences. Maybe you've noticed yourself deleting a post before anyone even saw it, not because it was bad, just because it suddenly didn't feel like you. Another profile looks completely different. This one revolves around humor. If you've ever spent time around Gen Z, you've probably noticed something strange. They joke about everything: stress, burnout, existential dread. Even serious topics somehow become memes. To older generations, this sometimes looks insensitive, but humor has always been one of humanity's oldest coping mechanisms. The difference is frequency. Millennials used humor after difficult experiences. Gen Z frequently uses humor while living through them. Imagine growing up during financial uncertainty, a global pandemic, constant climate discussions, rapid technological change, and endless streams of news arriving every minute. Your nervous system doesn't always have time to fully process one crisis before the next appears. So the brain does something clever.
It creates psychological distance. A joke becomes emotional breathing room, not because the problem is funny, because carrying every heavy emotion at full weight becomes impossible. Maybe that's why some of the darkest jokes often come from the people feeling the most overwhelmed. Then there's perhaps the biggest difference of all: identity. Ask many millennials who they are. They'll often answer with what they do. I'm a teacher. I'm an engineer. I'm a designer. Work became part of identity because career success was presented as the path towards stability. Now ask many Gen Z individuals. You'll often hear something broader: their hobbies, their values, their mental health journey, the communities they're part of, the causes they care about. Work is important, but it isn't the entire story. Some critics call this self-centered. Psychologically, though, it may simply reflect changing priorities. When traditional milestones become harder to reach, owning a home, long-term careers, financial certainty, people naturally invest more energy into the parts of identity they can actually control: who they become, what they believe, how they spend their time. Instead of asking, "What job defines me?" the question becomes, "What kind of life actually feels worth living?" And perhaps that's why conversations about boundaries, therapy, burnout, and emotional well-being appear so often among Gen Z. They're not necessarily avoiding responsibility. They're redefining success itself. But here's the twist: neither generation is completely right, and neither generation is completely wrong. Millennials often possess remarkable resilience. They learned patience, long-term commitment, the ability to keep moving even when recognition takes years. Gen Z brings something equally valuable: adaptability, emotional awareness, the willingness to question unhealthy norms instead of accepting them automatically. One generation learned endurance. The other learned flexibility. Imagine combining both. Someone patient enough to build, but flexible enough to change direction. Someone ambitious, without sacrificing their mental health. Someone emotionally aware, without becoming trapped by constant self-analysis. That combination might be exactly what the future needs, because every generation quietly overcorrects for the one before it. Parents who struggled financially often raise children who value security. Children raised with strict expectations often grow into adults who prioritize freedom. History doesn't move in straight lines. It swings like a pendulum, and perhaps Gen Z and millennials aren't opponents after all. Perhaps they're simply responding to different versions of uncertainty. So the next time someone says, "This generation is impossible to understand," pause for a second. Instead of asking what's wrong with them, ask what kind of world taught them to think that way. You may discover their behavior isn't strange. It's surprisingly logical. Now, I'm curious, are you Gen Z, a millennial, or somewhere between generations? Which of these patterns felt most familiar to you, and which one completely surprised you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the most interesting psychology isn't hidden inside textbooks. It's hidden inside conversations like these. And if you enjoy exploring the quiet patterns behind everyday human behavior, consider subscribing. There are always more layers beneath the surface than we first imagine.